My name is Randy Fleming, and for about 6 years I was the head of finance at one of the largest and most successful companies in the country, so I had a very comfortable life. In fact, I would say my life was a dream, or at least I thought it was, until everything got complicated. At the beginning of 2019, the company decided to make cutbacks, and guess what? I got laid off, and from that moment on, everything became a mess for me. I tried to look for a job, but it was like taking blind steps, and then the pandemic hit in 2020, further deepening my already difficult financial situation. Before long, my wife decided she no longer wanted to be with me and took the kids with her, leaving me with the burden of child support and no job. By 2021, I was covered in debt that I couldn't pay off, owed a lot of money to banks and my relatives, and had a lot of bills piling up. It was complete chaos, and I was really desperate. This situation pushed me to make a risky decision, one that went very, very wrong. It was November 10, 2021, and I already knew I needed to find quick ways to make money, so I started searching the internet for how to earn cash urgently, and sure enough, I was bombarded with ads for freelance jobs of dubious credibility. I ignored that because I had tried freelancing in my 40s and only got scammed, so I didn't want to go back to that. But after a while, I found a site that really caught my attention. It wasn't exactly what I was looking for, but it intrigued me because it talked about ancient rituals to earn money. I had never believed in such things, but in times of crisis you do whatever, so, browsing around a bit, I found a ritual that sounded easy and promising. It was called the fortune game, or something like that, and it read that it was not advisable to play, but for those seeking money and protection, it was at your own risk. If you won, you would be financially protected for a year, but if you lost, the consequences could be dire for you. To start this game, you had to summon the anima of the field. The thing is, you had to go to the backyard with a flashlight and repeat a question 7 times. This was, who will scare the crows away? If you didn't hear anything after the 7th time you repeated the question, that meant you had failed the summoning, but if you heard a voice say that that's not your biggest problem, then the game had already started. The first thing you had to do was to enter the house and look for a room with only one door. There you had to nail a crucifix and close everything you could. That would be your safe zone, so once you left that room, everything you could open in the house would be open, and your task was to close everything before midnight struck. As you were locking things up, you might see a strange guy dressed as a farmer with a look that would make your hair stand on end, but you had to forget about him, because that wasn't the real danger. He was just the messenger. If you looked out into the garden and saw the tall guy in the field, you had to run back to your shelter. In the meantime, that guy in the field would come looking for you, so you'd better close your eyes until the sun comes up. Otherwise, the anima of the field would get you, and pagan deities are not kind at all. But if you managed to close everything without looking, at dawn the anima of the field might reward you. I spent a few days mulling the idea over, doubting whether this was madness or whether there was any truth in it. Although I had never believed much in the supernatural, I knew it wasn't the wisest thing to try to summon a pagan deity. You never know after all, so I preferred to leave the matter alone. However, one day my ex-wife called me and I didn't like that at all. I knew she hadn't paid child support in a couple of months, but it was weird that she called me. Hi, I just wanted to let you know that my lawyers will be coming for you soon. I've filed a lawsuit and we have a court date in January. You'll get the papers soon, she said, then hung up without further ado. At that moment, I was flooded with a mixture of confusion and frustration, until anger took over. I couldn't believe he was doing this to me, but either way, he was putting me in an even more complicated situation than I was already in. Without thinking twice, I decided to carry out the game at my parents' house. They're hardly ever there on weekends, so it was the perfect place to do it. As night fell, around 6 o'clock, I started looking for the room I would use as a shelter, and my old childhood bedroom was the best option. It was almost empty, and there was nothing I had to lock. So without thinking too much, I grabbed a crucifix from my mother and placed it in the center of the room before leaving to start the game. It was 11 o'clock at night and already darkness covered everything. Every thought of what I was about to do made the garden seem more terrifying than ever. There was a lump in my throat as I lit the candle, and every step I took into the yard felt like a heaviness in my chest, as if someone was laying bricks over it. Following the ritual to the letter, I repeated the words over and over again. Who will chase away the crows? Who will chase away the crows? And so on, until by the 6th time, my hands were trembling slightly. In that instant, I wondered if I was really crazy to go through with this, and if it wouldn't be better to turn around, but I was already there, and it's not like I had much of a choice either. Then, taking a deep breath and filling myself with courage, I blurted out the phrase for the 7th time. Who will scare the crows away? The silence was almost unbearable. I could feel my heart racing every second, and after a while, without hearing anything, I decided to blow out the candle and return to the house. It was just then that I heard a spectral voice that chilled my blood saying, "That's not your biggest problem." My reaction was to immediately turn around to see who was talking, but luckily I remembered the rules of the game and kept moving towards the house. As I walked through the door, I noticed that everything had changed. All the doors, drawers, shelves, and cabinets were open, as if someone had been looking for something. At that moment, I remembered the rules of the game and immediately started closing everything quickly, but staying away from the windows, not daring to look outside. The kitchen took me longer than I expected, because there were piles of cans, bottles, and pans open, so I closed each thing one by one, and when I finally closed the kettle, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Holding the lid of the kettle, which was made of shiny metal, I noticed the reflection of a man in a hat behind me. My heart began to pound, and I froze for a moment as I put the lid on the teapot, hesitating whether to turn around to look at him. In the end, I decided to turn around as I walked out of the kitchen. The figure, clearly a farmer, was covered in dirt and in his gray, tattered clothes, but he made no noise as he followed me through the house. I remembered that the site said to ignore the guy, but that was easier said than done. I was completely terrified and had no idea where the figure was most of the time. Still, I continued on and finished closing the last door. I thought maybe the figure would disappear with that, but it didn't, and anxiety began to take hold of me. Then I began to wonder if I was doing it all wrong. That thing stood still behind me, so I checked the house again to make sure every window and door was completely closed. This time, I felt that the figure was no longer so far away. It seemed to be getting closer and closer. My heart was beating a mile a minute, and I couldn't stop shaking as I checked to make sure everything was securely locked. Suddenly, I noticed an empty can still open next to the sink, and thought that if I closed it, maybe that would make it disappear. So I walked towards the sink, but when I grabbed the can, it slipped and fell to the floor. At that moment, I felt that the figure was right behind me, looking over my shoulder. My attention was completely focused on it, so with a mixture of fear and adrenaline, I picked up the can again, and when I did, I found myself in front of the window over the sink, and what I saw took my breath away. In the garden there was a scarecrow of sorts, but it wasn't a traditional one. It was a monster that looked like it was made of bones, exposed flesh, and tangled branches, all of which exuded a dark, thick liquid that smelled like death. It was like a macabre set to deter birds, although I would say that its appearance, instead of scaring crows away, it could easily be an invitation to approach. The scarecrow was about 8 feet tall and had its arms outstretched, but instead of a pumpkin head, it had a human skull that looked straight at me. I froze, unable to move, as my eyes widened like saucers at the terrifying sight. The mysterious figure seemed to have disappeared, but I felt that the scarecrow was watching me, as if it knew I was there. The anima of the field began to approach little by little, and before I could understand what was happening, it was already running toward the house like a madman. The can I had picked up fell out of my hands, and my only idea was to get to my room upstairs as fast as possible. And as I ran, I could hear heavy footsteps behind me, and that sound filled me with panic. I ran with all my might, and just as I was about to close the door, I managed to catch a glimpse of the creepy creature I had summoned. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I slammed the door shut, and the creaking of the hinges echoed through the house, accompanied by brutal banging and scratching at the door. The sound was terrifying, as if something truly sinister was trying to get in, and in the midst of it all, I burst into tears, clutching the crucifix I had placed in the center of my shelter, and began to pray in the hope that the sun would rise soon. Hours passed, and in the meantime, the noise continued, like an echo that could not escape from my head. I was locked in that room, the room of my childhood, until 3 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. Although the sun had already risen, my fear would not go away for nothing, and the image of the spirit and the shadow that followed it continued to torment me. It was as if those visions were engraved in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had done something wrong in the game. Days went by, and my mental and emotional state only got worse. I was completely terrified and was unable to set foot out of my room. I felt like that thing was still on the other side of the door, waiting for me. In the end, my parents, concerned about my condition, decided to put me in a psychiatric clinic. I could no longer distinguish reality from nightmares, and the shadowy figures kept haunting my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I would wake up screaming and screaming. When the court date arrived, I didn't show up. My absence only served to make my ex-wife reclaim the apartment where I lived and take much of what little I had left. But honestly, I didn't care anymore. 2 years had passed since that night, and nothing seemed to help me forget what I had lived through, and my existence was only getting more and more complicated. I could barely get by with the janitorial job I managed to get after leaving the clinic. The routine was exhausting, and each day felt heavier than the last. Despite everything, I knew I had to warn others about the camp's anima. I couldn't stay quiet knowing that there were people who were unaware of the danger it posed, and I knew that if anyone else got into those silly games, they could end up facing something even worse than what I had experienced. Things could be better, and pulling the trigger to share my story was becoming more and more urgent, but a deep fear kept me from doing so. It was a night I will never forget, and I have to do what I can to make sure others don't go through the same thing. The sun was dipping below the horizon that evening. As the shadows of the trees lengthened and loomed over the house, in the kitchen the aroma of roasting turkey filled the air and mingled with the delicious smell of a pie fresh from the oven, and all the while I was there, slowly and nervously stirring a pot of gravy. I could feel my heart pounding, filled with anticipation. For me, Thanksgiving had always been a special time with family, but this year there was something in the air that wouldn't leave me at ease. It was as if an invisible tension hung in the air, and I could tell by the way my parents looked at each other. They were smiling at each other in a forced way, as if that smile was a shield to hide something else. They were excited about their new life, about those retirement plans they had been looking forward to for so long, and it seemed like they started counting down the days until they would be completely free of me. That excitement felt like a dagger twisting in my gut. "Dylan, would you set the table, please?" My mother shouted to me from the dining room. I nodded and forced a smile that didn't quite come off. My hands were shaking a little as I set the ladle aside, and I felt an uneasiness that I couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the weight of an announcement that was about to be revealed, something my parents had hinted at, but had never dared to say outright. And it seemed that today was the day. As I placed the silverware, I overheard bits and pieces of their conversation. "We can't keep supporting him," my father was saying in his voice that was low but firm. "He needs to learn to fend for himself." In that instant, my heart sank in my chest, and I knew exactly what that implied. They were determined to cut off my funding. That thought sent an icy chill up and down my spine, but I tried to remain calm. Dinner began as usual, with laughter and the clinking of glasses, but I felt completely disconnected, like a stranger in my own home. My parents talked animatedly about their retirement plans, about traveling the world, while I tried to force myself to join in their laughter when the time seemed right. But inside, I had a storm brewing stronger and stronger, and I was having a world of trouble keeping myself in check. The moment dessert was served, my mother's expression changed. "Joe," she started to say, hesitantly, "there's something we need to talk about." My pulse raced instantly. I knew this was the moment that would break the whole mood, so I clenched my fists under the table, trying to control the trembling in my hands. "No, Louisa," my father interrupted abruptly. "Let's enjoy this time together." But in his eyes I saw fear, real fear of what was to come. Feeling I couldn't stay any longer, I excused myself, saying I needed fresh air, and stepped out onto the porch. The night was cool, and the stars were shining in the sky, as if they were distant eyes watching every step I took, and as I paced back and forth, my mind was racing, filled with dark and frightening thoughts. When I finally returned inside the house, the atmosphere had changed drastically. My parents were no longer smiling, and their faces were marked by worry, disappointment, and, worst of all, fear. "Joe," my mother said, starting again. Her voice trembled slightly, and her gaze was serious. "We've decided." But before she could finish her sentence, something snapped inside me. All the years of feeling inadequate, of depending on them, washed over me like a tsunami. It was a moment I had both hoped for and dreaded for years, and now it was here, right in front of me. The reality of what it meant for my life was beginning to sink in, and I could feel everything unraveling around me. "That's enough," I suddenly shouted, causing my parents to startle and turn to me. "Do you think you can just leave me behind after all?" Their faces quickly turned pale as they realized that their son was not only angry, but also very close to losing control. After dinner, while they were busy cleaning up, I took the opportunity to escape to my room. Shadows danced on the walls and an eerie feeling came over me. At that moment, I decided to take out my notebook, the one I called the Book of Premeditation. Each page was full of my plans, to get knives, sledgehammers, chemicals, everything necessary to erase them from this life. I knew this day would come sooner or later, and I knew I had to prepare, but that didn't mean it would be easy. Adrenaline started pumping through my veins, and my heart was pounding as I thought about what I was about to do. I walked back to the kitchen, and with each step, the tension in my chest grew. I saw my father with his back turned, distracted, humming as he washed the dishes. "Dad?" I mumbled, trying to remain calm. His surprise quickly turned to confusion as he turned to me, and in one swift movement, I grabbed a knife from the counter and plunged it into his chest without a word. For an instant, all went silent, and time stood still as he gasped, not crediting what I had done. "What are you doing, Joe?" she stammered as her face reflected a mixture of disbelief and horror. I can't say I didn't feel some grief inside, but it was necessary. They wanted to get rid of me like I was trash. They wanted to push me aside and leave me penniless, and the thought of that made the anger inside me boil over. So I pulled out the knife and struck again, 46 times in all, each lunge fueled by years of resentment that turned to pure fury. Just as I finished with Dad, my mother came in and her scream shattered the air like breaking glass. "Joe!" she shrieked, but her scream only stoked my frenzy. The world around me faded away, and nothing mattered anymore but silencing them forever. She tried to defend herself. Her love for him drove her to try to save her husband and herself. Though she knew it was futile, I was out of control, as everything that had once been a happy home turned to pure chaos. Bodies fell to the floor like lifeless rag dolls. When it was all over, a wave of reality hit me. What had I done? I dragged their bodies into the bathroom, where I had prepared everything. Plastic containers filled with corrosive chemicals awaited their remains, like hungry beasts ready to devour what was left of them. And as I dismembered them into the corrosive mixture, a sense of relief washed over me. It was like a release. It was as if years of pent-up resentment and rage had left my body in one fell swoop, leaving me as light as a feather. Finishing that task, I let his remains dissolve in the acid and retreated to my room, seeking to escape the horror of my actions. The house felt different. It was now exclusively mine. At that moment, I looked out the window and observed the seemingly quiet world outside. A smile formed on my face as I realized that no one would ever know what had happened here. Not today, not ever. It was days before anyone noticed they were missing, days filled with paranoia and guilt, gnawing inside as if rats had taken up residence in my stomach. The police eventually arrived after a few days to do a welfare check, after my mother's co-workers reported her missing. Panic set in when they arrived at my door. They found everything. The pot boiling on the stove, still hot, filled with what used to be part of her head, different body parts dissolving in the acid, and notes detailing every step of my plan, strewn across the floor like confetti at a crooked celebration. With each gruesome detail they uncovered, all I could think about was how close I had come to freedom and how quickly it had all turned to chaos. Now I'm in prison awaiting the time for my execution, and in the meantime I keep thinking that maybe I got a little out of hand with my parents. I know now that it would have been wiser to leave home, or perhaps dispose of the bodies in a more effective way. My name is Maria, and the truth is that I don't have much of my life to tell. I've always been a pretty quiet girl. I don't like to be the center of attention at all. I know some people don't like the way I live, but, well, most people haven't been kidnapped as a child. Something like that leaves a deep mark, and it doesn't go away easily, even when you grow up. I always thought it was best to stay out of trouble, but I learned the hard way that trouble is like a thin thread that, with any nonsense, can break. It all started when I decided to give my closet a makeover and revamp my style a bit. I had heard of a website that sold cute and cheap lingerie, and while I'm not one to shop on the spur of the moment, that night I just went with the flow, and after a couple of clicks, I had placed my order. A couple of days later, I received an email confirming that my shipment was on its way, and an additional message from the seller. At first, I thought it was one of those automatic messages that you never look at again, but for some reason I read the whole thing. One part of the message caught my attention. The most important thing is the satisfaction of our customers, especially those who, like you, will look so good in these garments. At that moment, the excitement I had about getting something new turned into a bit of discomfort. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that the guy behind the message was a little weird. I tried not to read too much into it, although that was the first sign that there was something very wrong there. The next week, the package arrived. It was a cute little white box, and when I opened it, I found the lingerie I had ordered, delicately wrapped in tissue paper. In addition, there was an envelope that I assumed was a thank you or a promotion. But when I opened it, the message I found chilled my blood. I hope you enjoy your purchase as much as I enjoyed preparing it for you, Maria. In that instant, my smile froze. How did she know my name? Instantly, I laughed at myself. Of course, my name was on the shipping address. There was a moment when I felt like I had been fooled by the message, but I couldn't help but think the guy was a stalker, because he definitely sounded like one, or at least to me. Days passed without anything unusual happening, and I decided that that would just be a bad rap with a store that, despite having good clothes, I definitely wouldn't consider again for new orders. Until one night, as I was walking home from work, I felt someone looking at me. I looked around and saw no one, so I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. However, that feeling didn't go away, and the following days, every time I went out, I had the impression that someone was following me, as if they had eyes staring at my back. Suddenly, I started noticing strange things. The door of my apartment, which I always left closed, now felt a little open, and objects that I used to leave in certain places appeared in other places and things like that. My paranoia went through the roof, but I had no concrete proof, just this growing feeling of being watched. In other circumstances, I would have called the police, but what would I tell them? Hey, I think something is wrong because my stuff is not where I left it, and I feel like someone is watching me. I don't have any proof, but I think it's like this. They would never take me seriously. Besides, I wasn't even sure if anything had really happened. I could be making up movies and just be a case of common forgetfulness. In light of that situation, I thought about buying some cameras for my house, but I stopped myself. Maybe I was overreacting and didn't want to make such a big purchase out of a bit of paranoia. Plus, I lived alone and didn't have much money to speak of either. I still think about those moments and what was really going on, and all I can think about is that I really needed those cameras. The day it all got out of control started out like a normal one. I went to work and tried to concentrate, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. When I left, I decided to take a different way home to throw off whoever was following me, although I wasn't sure if it would work, as the day was cloudy and the street seemed emptier than usual. Suddenly, I felt something on my shoulder and turned quickly, terrified, but it was only a tree branch. That was already too much. Paranoia was taking hold of me. I must leave soon, I thought, so I quickened my pace. Without warning, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. I don't know why, but I knew the pace was determined, as if that person was determined to catch up with me. In view of this, I panicked and started to run aimlessly. I just wanted to get away as fast as possible. I looked over my shoulder, and then I saw him. A guy was running after me. I couldn't make out his face because he had something covering him, but the fact that he was chasing me was not a figment of my imagination. He was really stalking me. In desperation, I ran to a neighborhood store, and as I entered, the owner, an older man who was very friendly, looked at me with a worried look on his face. So I quickly explained that someone was following me, and he let me stay in the back of the store. I thought I would be safe there. Hiding in an open store should be the solution, right? But no. Suddenly, the door burst open and a guy walked in, with a friendly expression that made me hesitate. He didn't look like a bad person, but when the owner asked him what he wanted, the guy pulled out a gun without another word and pointed it in the old man's face, ordering him not to move. I stood paralyzed in the back of the store, watching everything from the shadows, my heart racing and panic coursing through my body. It was the same guy who had been following me. "Sorry for the inconvenience. I know this isn't pleasant," he said very politely, as he kept pointing at the store owner, "but I need to know if you are hiding a girl who just came in here." The old man, confused, tried to calm him down. "I don't know what you're talking about, no one has come in here." But the guy was persistent. "You must be making a mistake. Listen, I'm not here to rob," the man with the gun said. "Please just let me go," replied the old man, who seemed to want to help me, but the other guy was in control of the situation. There was a moment of silence, but it was only a moment of calm before the storm. Suddenly, the madman was unleashed, hitting the store owner with the butt of the gun again and again, until he fell to the ground, inert. Blood stained the walls, and I could only watch, terrified and trying not to make a sound. Once the owner was clearly dead, the guy kept hitting him, always smiling as if this was just a game to him. Then it started to become clear that my life was worth nothing to him. I was so terrified and in shock that I curled into a ball in the corner, feeling like I was next on the list. I was in the dark, wishing and praying to all the saints that he wouldn't find me. The guy started walking slowly around the store, breathing hard, his voice echoing in the air with a mixture of rage and madness. "Look what you made me do, Maria. Why did you drag this poor guy into this?" I bit my lip to keep from making any noise, trying to control the trembling that ran through my body. At that moment, I squeezed my eyelids tightly shut, wishing to disappear. I had always liked to play hide and seek, but I was 12 years old then. "We're too old for this, don't you think?" "Although I admit you're good at this game," the psychopath said, getting closer and closer. Suddenly, I felt like I could move, and with one swift movement I slid across the floor and ran out the back door of the store. But he grabbed me by the hair and stopped me, causing me to slip and fall to the ground. But fortunately, he fell with me. With both of us on the ground, he lunged at me, but I reacted quickly and pepper sprayed him in the face. Pepper spray is something I could never be without in my bag, and although I had never had to use it before, I was grateful to myself for always having that precaution. After receiving the pepper spray shock, the guy just stood there writhing and clutching his face, while I took the opportunity to get up and run away as fast as I could. But as I was walking away, I heard his laughter from the ground, and I froze. He was laughing out loud, as if he was amused by my resistance. However, I didn't dare look back. I just ran until my lungs burned, and my legs could take no more. Hours later, the police showed up at the store and found the guy playing with the owner's corpse, as if it were a doll. They arrested him instantly because he offered no resistance, just smiled without a care in the world. An officer who stayed with me told me everything while I was at the station. The crazy guy was talking like nothing, as if he was at a party. At first they thought he was just playing around, but they soon realized the guy wasn't faking it, and that made the cops very uncomfortable. When I finally got home after making my statement, I lay down on the bed, but something caught my eye. I found a handwritten love letter. It was a letter describing how the guy would torture and kill me in the most romantic way possible. The scariest part was that he planned to read that letter to me once he had me captive. His intention was to follow me home, and he knew where I lived. I can't tell you what the letter said because it is too twisted and disgusting. All I can say is that it was much, much worse than anything you can imagine. Urban legends and myths were always the kind of things my friends and I loved to explore growing up. We would spend hours telling stories, joking and scaring each other with all sorts of scary myths that abound on the internet, but, to be honest, we never really cared to find out if they were real or not. But that all changed in our last week of high school, when we decided it was time to take our curiosity to the next level. My friend Kenneth and I had been watching some YouTube videos of people playing games about summoning spirits and demons. These talked about games like Charlie or Bloody Mary, and I don't know why. But the idea of encountering something supernatural got us pretty excited and made us wonder if those stories were just stories or if there was really something behind them. However, this was a question that, in retrospect, we wish we hadn't asked. It was our last week of school, and while most of our classmates were out in full force, organizing parties and celebrations, outings here and there, it occurred to me that the best thing we could do together before we split up to go to college was to try something we had always wanted to do, something that would push us to the limit, and we both had the same thing in mind. My parents were out of town that week, so I figured there was no better time to do it. That afternoon, I sat down at my computer and started searching the internet for some of the more popular myths we could try to summon, and this is where I realized that most of the instructions I found were either confusing or simply too complicated to do at home. So I kept looking for quite a while, and after almost an hour of searching, I discovered a site that compiled a bunch of urban legends and provided instructions on how to summon various entities. Although the site had a couple of warnings, I kept looking until I finally found a game I had never heard of. It was called One Man Hideout. The next day, I arrived with the plan in mind and shared the idea with my friends. I was very excited about it, but Sophie, as expected, was skeptical at first. However, Kenneth and I began to encourage her, promising her that there was nothing to worry about. I told her I would be back later that day to explain exactly how to play and what we needed from each other. Well guys, this is called One Man Hide and Seek, and the rules are very simple, I began to explain. First of all, we need some sort of doll that doesn't look human but has limbs. Sophie, I think one of your rag dolls from when you were a child might do. She looked at me with a mixture of horror and amusement, like she wasn't quite sure, but deep down she was excited about the idea. In the end, she nodded and said she would get one. Now, we need to open the doll with a needle, empty it and fill it with rice, I said. Kenneth interrupted me at that point and asked, "Wait, you said rice? What's that for?" "Yes," I replied, "because rice supposedly attracts demons." Sophie's eyes went wide when I said that, and then she swallowed dry but didn't say anything, so I went on with the explanation. "Okay, now we cut our nails and put them in with the rice." Kenneth frowned. "Wait, what? Nails? Why that?" "Because we shouldn't use other people's nails. They might get hurt if we do," I clarified. As I spoke, Sophie and Kenneth kept laughing, and I didn't understand why they thought it was so funny. But I continued with the instructions, determined to explain what we had to do. Next, we'll take a piece of red thread, and sew the doll back together, but we'll leave a little extra thread, and we'll tie that extra thread around the doll before we join the two ends together. It's supposed to represent the blood vessels in the doll and trap the spirit inside it. Are you seriously going to teach us how to do what looks like a satanic rite in your living room? Joked Kenneth. But I was too focused on the instructions to notice his teasing, so I continued. So, as I was telling you, we fill the bathtub with water and put the doll in there, like a portal separating the spirit world from the real world. After that, we have to find a room to hide in. I was thinking the living room might work if Kenneth has the candles his mom normally uses for yoga. Kenneth nodded, still somewhat skeptical, but I got caught up in the excitement of the moment and went on with the list of instructions. We will place a cup of salt water and the needle in the room, and we also have to give the doll a name that is not ours or anyone else's that we know, I said. Then Kenneth raised his hand and said, Luciana, I think that's perfect. What do you say, Sophie? Sophie shrugged. I don't have a problem with the name. We all nodded and I finished giving the instructions. It was already getting late and I wanted to hurry. Then we turn off all the lights and devices except the TV. Then we repeat the doll's name 3 times, and when we're done, we run into the room, turn on the TV, and try to be as quiet as possible. Why does the TV have to be on? Asked Sophie, whispering and a little doubtful. And what happens if we don't manage to stay quiet? Kenneth, laughing, told her, Are you scared or what? I could only think that was precisely what we were hoping for. At that point, I told my friends to shut up once and for all, and after that silence took over the room for a moment as we concentrated. I told the guys that we should close our eyes and count to 10. Once we get to the end, we grab the needle and head back to the tub, call out to the doll, Luciana, we found you. Then we cut the thread that binds the doll and say 3 times, Luciana, you're next. Then we put the doll back in the bathtub and take refuge in the room, trying to remain completely silent, fill our mouths with salt water and start looking for Luciana. She is supposed to stay in the bathroom, so there is no reason to worry. Then we spray the salt water from our mouths on her face and say, We found you. Then we burn the doll and throw the ashes away, I finished. It was at that point that Sophie, with a look somewhere between worry and doubt, finally threw out the question, What if she's not in the bathroom and we can't find her? That got me thinking. The site doesn't say anything about that, I said. That's why we have to keep the salt water nearby, as protection. That's all they've told us. Seeing the concern on their faces made me doubt whether all this was really a good idea. I had a bad feeling, but decided not to give it any more thought. In the end, we agreed that we would return home early before midnight. Sophie left around 11 p.m., while Kenneth stayed until 1 in the morning. The truth was that I wasn't sure we had enough time to get ready since the game was supposed to start at exactly 3 a.m. When Kenneth finally arrived, we quickly got organized and in about 30 minutes we had everything ready. The ragdoll Sophie had brought was yellow and missing an eye. It didn't seem like a big deal because her appearance wasn't exactly human, and that was all that mattered. The time was approaching and it was almost 3 a.m. Surprisingly, Kenneth looked excited and had overcome his paranoia, if he ever had any. No one was more excited than he was, as the clock struck 2:58 a.m. So we turned off the lights and turned on the TV, and before we knew it, it was time to go into the bathroom. In truth, the image of the doll floating in the bathtub full of water was not as frightening as I had imagined. Kenneth walked over to the doll and lifted it up, saying loudly, Kenneth, Sophie, and Philip, you're first. He repeated this as he lifted her up, then put her back in the tub, and we all returned to the living room. At first, nothing strange seemed to be happening, so we closed our eyes and started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But before we got to 10, I heard a strange sound coming from the screen. I snapped my eyes open and saw Kenneth grabbing Sophie and laughing loudly. This pair of fools couldn't take anything seriously, but in the end, I also got a good laugh at how ridiculous we looked, and we stood laughing for a while before deciding that maybe it was best to end the game there. However, something in the atmosphere had changed. Suddenly the air felt thick, and the room became a little colder than usual. At that moment, we all looked at each other, and I felt that we had crossed a line we should not have crossed. I returned to the bathroom and saw that the doll was still floating in the tub. At that moment, I felt a little calmer, so I grabbed the dial, cut the thread with the needle and said, "We've found you. You're next, Luciana." But just at that moment, I noticed something strange. Even though the wrist had been submerged in the water, the dial in my hand was dry, almost as if it hadn't touched the water at all. That made me feel uncomfortable, but I tried not to think too much about it. I left the doll back in the tub and we went back to the living room, filling our mouths with salt water one more time, just as the instructions read. And after a while, when nothing unusual was still happening, I saw Sophie relax a little. I decided it was time to stop this madness and finish the game for real. But just as we were walking to the bathroom, Kenneth spit out the water and said, "This is really fun, guys, but seriously, this is just a bunch of nonsense. We'd better go play video games." That sounded like a good idea, but I wanted to get it over with, so I opened the bathroom door again, expecting to see the rag doll floating by, but instead, shivers ran through me from head to toe. The doll was gone, and instead, there was an uncomfortable feeling in the air, as if the room was too cold and the water was completely still. "What the hell?" said Kenneth. But before he could speak further, a rumble echoed from the living room and my blood ran cold. We walked back slowly, and when we arrived, we saw that the TV was changing channels by itself with no sound. I immediately reached for the remote control, and when I turned it off, the room was plunged into darkness. Logically, I ran to turn on the lights, and when I did, I saw that Sophie and Kenneth had expressions of absolute fear on their faces. I couldn't help but feel that maybe I had made a big mistake by forcing them to play. "Calm down. We just have to find the doll and spray salt water on its face. Do you have your bottles right?" They both nodded. "Okay. If we're together, we'll be fine," I said, trying to calm them down. But then Sophie, completely freaked out, said, "And why can't we just go home?" Frustration was evident in her tone, so I tried to remain calm. "The site warned us that if we leave, we might leave something behind. It won't let us get on with our lives. Relax, we have to look for the doll." We spent about an hour looking all over the house, and the weird thing is that we started hearing banging and strange noises that shouldn't be there. Our phones were out of signal, and leaving was not an option. The longer we took, the more weird sounds we started to hear, until finally, we heard some laughter, but it wasn't normal laughter. It was deep laughter that seemed to be coming from everywhere. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the house. "Philip, Sophie, Kenneth, if any of you wish to send me back to my kingdom, then come and fetch me upstairs. But I warn you, I will not return alone. A soul must return with me." The voice sounded strange and deep, and the temperature of the place turned icy. "What does that mean?" asked Sophie, visibly frightened. "You know what that means," replied Kenneth. They both looked at me, as if searching for some answer or a plan, but the truth was that I was terrified too. Things were getting heavy and I had no idea what to do. "Let's go find her here," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. We grabbed our saltwater bottles and I said, "Whatever happens, don't let the water come out of your mouths and stick together, okay?" I warned. Without hesitation, we started up the stairs, feeling the temperature drop with each step. The laughter we heard earlier now echoed throughout the house, and we could tell it was clearly coming from my parents' bedroom. Kenneth advanced toward the bedroom door as we followed. When we arrived, the room became completely silent, and Kenneth pushed the door slowly. But before we could enter, something pulled him in and the door slammed shut. At that moment, Sophie and I looked at each other in terror and started banging on the door, but it was as if someone was holding it firmly shut. I gritted my teeth and kept kicking until I finally managed to open it. But what I saw is the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life. Luciana was on top of Kenneth, with her hands planted on the floor. Although her hands were nowhere near him, Kenneth had deep marks on his chest, as if he was being torn apart. I stood transfixed at that grisly scene, feeling like my friend was being attacked by a demonic doll. Suddenly, Luciana looked at me for an instant with her one eye, and I could almost swear she smiled. But before she could do anything, Sophie threw salt water in her face, and as if it had been just a dream, the doll fell limp on the floor, and everything went back to normal. The lights stabilized, the laughter stopped, the temperature returned to normal, and it felt as if a black cloud left the room all at once, but Kenneth's wounds were still there. His chest was open and ripped open, as if he had been attacked by a wild animal. It was absolutely terrifying. We immediately burned the doll, and our phones came back on right after that, and Sophie immediately called for help. Kenneth survived, but as much as we tried to tell the cops what really happened, there was no way they would believe us. They spent months trying to understand the case, as the story we told was consistent with Kenneth's injuries, which certainly didn't appear to have been done by anything human. But of course, the cops would never believe that a possessed doll was the one who attacked him. In the end, they closed the case, saying that we were probably hallucinating under the effect of something, and that, hopefully, he had been attacked by an animal. A conclusion I wished was true. After that night, our interest in urban legends completely faded, and unfortunately, so did our friendship. Now that I am a father, I spent hours wondering why the demon decided to leave Kenneth alive. My sleepless nights have diminished, but I will never forgive myself for endangering his life just out of curiosity in an urban myth. I'm not one to believe that all those stories have any truth to them, but I know that you should never, ever play one-man hide-and-seek. I used to work at a diner called Diner Delights in a small town in Pennsylvania. Sometimes people ask me if I ever witnessed one of those famous diner fights, but honestly, it wasn't that kind of place. We were just down the street from a street full of bars and less than a mile from the local college campus, which meant we got a fair amount of students during the crazy hours of the night. However, in all my night shifts, I only saw a couple of fights, which, to be fair, were more like shoving before friends intervened. That's not to say, however, that I didn't quit after one rather violent incident, although it wasn't a typical fight by any means. On weekends, the diner would fill up with drunken college kids and sports fans coming in for our food specials, while Monday through Friday the shifts could be pretty quiet. It was common to see a few kids laughing and taking a while to decide what to order, and we never had a problem with truckers coming in to enjoy some burgers and fries. But that night specifically was different. A guy who looked like a real mess came through the door. The man had a look that didn't promise anything good, and I swear, when I saw him walk in, I thought he was going to pull out a gun and rob us right there. Even though in my time working there had never been a robbery, there was always that unsettling possibility. So of course I was on alert every time someone who fit that profile approached the counter. This guy was definitely one of those cases. He looked nervous and shaky, and after ordering his food, he sat at a table looking around without touching his order of grilled quesadillas. I felt so uncomfortable. I let my coworkers know that his presence gave me goosebumps as I continued to clean my tables. That's when another customer came in, a regular guy with brown hair who looked pretty normal. He ordered a coffee and a triple chocolate cake with cream, sat down at the counter and started drinking his coffee. Meanwhile, the nervous guy was still visibly fidgeting, and our gazes met a couple of times. His expression was pure panic, as if he was scared of something no one else could see. Suddenly, I heard the guy in the cafe address the guy behind him. "Don't I know you?" The other guy turned around, surprised. "I don't think so," he said, though soon the first guy began to recall moments from his childhood. I heard him mention that they had both been in the same elementary school, and that his math teacher was Mrs. Melendez. It's a peculiar moment, running into someone from your past in a diner at 1:30 a.m. For a moment, I was lost in their memories and smiles, but when I came back with more detergent, I saw that they were ending their friendly encounter with a, "It was great to see you, and take care, and I wish it had all ended there," in that warm goodbye. However, the situation turned terrifying in the blink of an eye. The cafe guy stopped at the door and said, "Oh, one more thing." And just then, I saw him pull a gun out of his jacket. My heart almost stopped at that moment, and what happened next flashed in front of my eyes as if in slow motion. The guy who had been behind him didn't have a chance to react. He looked up just in time to be shot 3 times straight in the chest. The guy collapsed on his plate right there, an absolutely horrifying scenario that I couldn't process. The silence that followed was overwhelming. I quickly ducked under the counter as I listened to the sound of the gun hitting the floor. No one was moving. There was just an aura of shock and confusion in the diner. After a few moments that felt like an eternity, a woman began screaming, breaking the tense calm and sharpening the terror in the room. There was no protocol for handling something like this in our little Waffle House, so no one knew what to do. So logically, we had to improvise. We did what we could. We asked those who hadn't run out to get behind the counter to guide them to a safe exit to the back parking lot. They were all in complete shock, and the screaming woman seemed to have lost her mind, and her terror was contagious. Diner Delights ended up closed for several days while the coroner's inquest was conducted, as if such a tragic event could be undone. Diner management offered employees free counseling and a bonus for those who decided to return to work, but I did not take them up on that offer. My co-workers who were there that night decided to return, but I felt unable to face that place again. Call me a coward, but every time I tried to imagine myself doing the routine of clearing tables, I remembered the boy fallen over his food, blood dripping past his plate. For me, it was unthinkable to go back to work there and carry on as if nothing had happened. I couldn't even walk past the place without that image replaying in my head. I understood that some people might be able to leave such a trauma behind, but personally, I preferred to look for a job elsewhere. I wanted to forget that terrible memory, to not have to see every day a place where I had spent one of my worst moments watching someone's life being lost abruptly and so violently. So I left Diner Delights in search of something that wasn't tainted by the tragedy, and that was the best decision I could have made.